In this video lecture, I'm going to be looking at Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, a philosophical work that was published actually after his death, a work that argues against what he had written in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus in his earlier career, a philosopher who had changed philosophy twice, first with the Tractatus and second with the Philosophical Investigations. A fascinating person, fascinating, full of stories of chasing people, Karl Popper, others, right, around with a fire poker, or other stories of the ways in which he would teach kids or go off to the Soviet Union to leave philosophy and become, or wanting to become, a factory worker, to do something useful, and yet could not help but come back to philosophy. Fascinating person, and perhaps an even more fascinating theory of language. Now, Wittgenstein begins the Philosophical Investigations by quoting Augustine from Augustine's Confessions. Augustine writes, "When grown-ups named some object and at the same time turned towards it, I perceived this, and I grasped that the thing was signified by the sound they uttered, since they meant to point it out. This, however, I gathered from their gestures, the natural language of all peoples, the language that by means of facial expression and the play of eyes, of the movements of the limbs and the tone of voice, indicates the affections of the soul when it desires, or clings to, or rejects, or recoils from something. In this way, little by little, I learned to understand what things the words which I heard uttered in their respective places in various sentences signified. And once I got my tongue around these signs, I used them to express my wishes." So what Augustine is conveying here is known as the picture theory of language. This idea that words convey the totality of that which is signified in the idea, in the concept expressed. Now, this is similarly argued for in Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. So as Wittgenstein wrote in this earlier work, a proposition is a picture of reality. For if I understand a proposition, I know the situation that it represents. And I understand the proposition without having had its sense explained to me. The idea is that, right, if a word truly signifies something, then it is exhaustive. That if I understand that word, I understand exactly what it signifies, as if that word is like a picture of reality, and all that is contained or meant to convey by that word is what would be contained in the picture. So we make to ourselves pictures of facts, right? We have a fact where we say, for example, a chair, right? What a chair is, the essence or the nature of a chair. Now, the word chair signifies the nature of a chair, right? If chair truly signifies what a chair is, and therefore we can communicate chairs and be talking about the same thing, right? Then it would be the same thing as a fact of exactly what it is. It is definite. So the picture is a model of reality. The elements of the picture stand in the picture for the objects which compose or make up that object, in this case, right, like a chair. So the picture consists in the fact that its elements are combined with one another in a definite way, a way which could not be otherwise, which is why when we, for example, say the word chair, we're talking about exactly the same thing. In this way, then, the picture is a fact in the same way that if the word chair means anything at all, it must mean exactly the fact of what a chair is in its object. Now, the kind of articulation of the picture theory of language that is argued by Wittgenstein in his earlier work, the Tractatus, this is part of a school known as logical positivism. And what is key here is, unlike Augustine, who is going to make metaphysical claims, like in his philosophy of language, that language is really a way of reminding that we never learn anything in communication, but only from God illuminating us, so, right, that there must be a God. Logical positivism would say that there could be no God because it's not empirically verifiable. So in this way, logical positivism attempts to be a kind of anti-metaphysicalist, or an anti-metaphysical philosophy, insofar as it wants to say that any kind of word like God, spirit, anything like that, which conveys a kind of immateriality, that those words really mean nothing because they cannot be empirically verifiable, the way like a word chair can be verifiable by looking at it, by investigating it to see if when we say chair it holds up with exactly how the chair is constituted. And we'll see that Wittgenstein here in the Philosophical Investigations is going to argue against that, that kind of anti-metaphysics. Okay, so Wittgenstein says that the picture theory of language works for nouns, but it is a primitive system of communication. He gives this example here in the first aphorism. So he says, now think of the following use of language. I send someone shopping. I give him a slip of paper marked 5 red apples, right? That's all that's written on that piece of paper, 5 red apples. He takes the slip to the shopkeeper, who opens the drawer marked apples. Then he looks up the word red in a chart and finds a color sample next to it. Then he says the series of elementary number words. I assume that he knows them by heart, up to the word 5. And for each number word, he takes an apple of the same color as the sample out of the drawer. It is in this and similar ways that one operates with words. But how does he know where and how he is to look up the word red? And what he is to do with the word 5? Well, I assume that he acts. He acts as I have described. Explanations come to an end somewhere. But what is the meaning of the word 5? No such thing was in question here when the slip was given that said 5 red apples. Only how the word 5 is used. Right, so if the picture theory of language is correct, then all that could be conveyed or signified by that piece of paper that says 5 red apples is an image of just 5 red apples. Yet the shopkeeper sees this, goes and collects 5 red apples to hand to the customer who gave them the piece of paper. How could that be possible? And yet it does. We talk this way all the time. The reason, as Wittgenstein says, is that the meaning of a word is its use in the language, in that language which is being spoken. The meaning of a word is not something that is definite, as if could be exhaustively articulated by a picture of that object that is signified. But meaning is conveyed by use, by acting out that word. So another example here in aphorism 2. He says that philosophical notion of meaning is at home in a primitive idea of the way language functions. But one might instead say that it is the idea of a language more primitive than ours. Let us imagine a language in which the description given by Augustine is right. The language is meant to serve for communication between builder A and an assistant B. A is building with building stones. There are blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. B has to pass him the stones, and to do so in the order in which A needs them. For this purpose, they make use of a language consisting of the words block, pillar, slab, beam. A calls them out. B brings the stone which he has learnt to bring at such and such a call. Conceive of this as a complete primitive language. Right, so we can imagine construction workers, okay? And when a certain person needs a slab, they just say slab. Slab is yelled out. Another worker comes and brings them a slab, right? How would they know just by the word slab that what is meant is not, what a slab is, but to go and get a thing that is a slab and bring it to me so I can do the activity with the slab that is meant? The speaking of a language is part of an activity, or, as Wittgenstein says it, a form of life. When we use language is more than just our words. It is wrapped up in the everyday sense of how we constitute our existence. That we basically play games, the way in which we use language. So one can learn the rules of chess, for example, right? And of course, how do I learn this? I don't necessarily learn this by having a picture of what exactly a chess piece is, right? If someone were to show me all of the chess pieces or the chess board with pieces scattered throughout it, I don't learn what chess is by looking at it. I learn what chess is, of course, by learning how to play it. Now, even though I might learn the rules of chess, this doesn't make one into a grand master. And we regularly or ordinarily speak of knowing the game of chess, even if we're not a grand chess master. How could this be the case? Because remember, the picture theory of language says, right, a word has meaning if its signification or its significate, right, is exhaustive. Yet, we regularly admit that one can know the game of chess without actually being a grand chess master, without knowing all the rules, every single move possible in the game. Right? The difference between knowing what checkmate is, or this is the difference, between knowing what checkmate is and how to checkmate. To know what a checkmate is to know how to checkmate. Language is the same way. Right? We don't learn what it is to think philosophically without studying philosophy, without doing philosophy. We don't learn what washing our hands is without knowing how to wash our hands, without doing the activity. And we don't learn, for example, what the game of soccer is without seeing people play soccer, without attempting to play soccer. So we know what a goal is because we know what is supposed to happen with the ball, the way in which it goes into a net. What are the rules in which this can occur? Now, the function of words, Wittgenstein says, is as diverse as the function of tools in a toolbox. So we might have a hammer, we might have a Phillips head screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver. We might have any number of tools, nuts and bolts and so on, right? Because they all perform different functions. So sometimes I might want to call out, ask a friend for water, okay, because I'm thirsty. So water, right, is useful then in getting a drink and quenching my thirst. Whereas perhaps if I actually need my thirst, quenched, a soda perhaps, or a piece of bread, actually perhaps better example, a piece of bread, right? This does not convey the use of the term quenching one's thirst. So we reserve the word bread for something else to convey, right, a certain kind of substance that maybe can make sandwiches with, is baked, and so on and so forth. It's also the case that the same word can perform different functions in the same way that a tool can perform, the same tool can perform different functions. So we might, for example, think of the word like in logic, okay? In logic, when we talk about a proposition being valid, what it means for a proposition to be valid is very precise insofar as, right, the argument is deductive, and it is that if the premises are true, the propositions are structured in a way that the conclusion must be true, right? That is a valid argument. Yet in ordinary conversations, we say something is valid if it makes sense, if we think it's generally justified, right? If one can perhaps go along with what someone else said. And then, what does go along mean? I mean, that seems very ambiguous. And yet we use it all the time and we act on it, right? So you wouldn't want to say that an argument is valid if we're talking about inductive arguments, because that is not appropriate, unless perhaps you're talking with some academic philosophy friends. Then you actually both have a sense of what it means when you say, oh, that idea, that's a valid idea. But it doesn't actually make sense to say an idea is valid in other specific contexts in philosophy, right? So some examples of the variety of language games that we play. And so academic philosophy, for example, is a kind of language game, whereas just talking with your friends about some crazy ideas, that's a different kind of language game. So some examples of these are like giving orders and acting on them. For example, slab, right? If I were to just yell out slab in class randomly, that wouldn't make sense. It would be like trying to play soccer whereby there's no such thing as offsides, right? That's just part of of how soccer is played, is that there is an offside. Describing an object by its appearance or by its measurements. I mean, there's a different way in which we explain like a book, okay, a book cover, and yet we could talk in science, chemistry of the compound makeup of the book cover and how its appearance then is different, or the way in which we might measure it in different contexts. What does it mean to report an event? I mean, reporting a sport event is going to be very different from reporting, let's say, a murder on the news. Forming and testing a hypothesis. Now, one, right, that has a kind of technical understanding in science, yet that also changes over time, right, depending on how we wanted to go about investigating certain phenomena. Presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams depends on the kind of discipline you're involved in. Certain graphs you want to use to display different kinds of data. And it could be the case that if you use the same graph to try and display different kinds of data, you might actually distort then the truth, we might say, that is in the data that we mean to convey. Again, right, making up a story and reading one, acting in a play, guessing riddles. I mean, cracking a joke, right? All the time, how to crack a joke, perhaps, let's say, like respectfully, right? That changes over time depending on how our understanding of what it means to tell a joke evolves, In some ways, right, telling a joke, we might start with knock, knock. But that's a very kind of a simple, juvenile way, perhaps, to tell a joke. That might be different from, something that you might want more complex, for like a Netflix special. Of course, unless you turn the knock-knock joke into, something more complex, right? So the context matters in telling that joke. Translating from one language to another, that's very, very important. And that, in a way, is what is at the heart of this issue of what a word signifies. I'll get to that in a moment with the movie Arrival. I'll mention that. Finally, requesting, thanking, cursing, greeting, praying, right? There are certain ways in which we greet one another. Perhaps a bow suffices, perhaps a handshake, right? So when we greet someone, we mean different things in the activities that we do. Now, they might signify, in a sense, the same thing, in that it is the handshake and the bow is welcoming. But sometimes you can use the same word, and yet it means different things. I'm thinking, for example, mucho gusto, right? In Costa Rica, mucho gusto is used synonymously with de nada, which literally means of nothing, right? But it's a way of saying, you're welcome, right? And it's common in the Spanish-speaking, like Central South America, right, to say de nada, when someone says gracias, right? Like, thank you, you say de nada, you're welcome. In Costa Rica, it's actually customary to say mucho gusto, which then if you tell a Guatemalan, for example, they are going to not understand why you're saying mucho gusto, right? That doesn't have the same sense because they don't use that word in the same way. Why? What does it mean to use that word in that same or a different way? For Wittgenstein, right, as mentioned, a language game is a form of life. So when we imagine a language, when we imagine what is being conveyed, what is being signified in the words spoken, we are imagining how a people, right, and this is important, for Wittgenstein, there is no private language, right? There are no thoughts which convey an idea which only one person can know. Because language is public, language is acted out in our communal existence. So when we imagine a language, when we think about conveying words, they signify ways in which we relate to one another, which we act out activities. So again, right, if I called out slab in class, this would not have meaning, because what we do in class, like in my philosophy class, is not to get pieces of slabs to build structures. But if I was, again, in a construction context, then that makes sense. It conveys a certain use in the word slab that I can do what I'm there to do, and therefore make a living, get paid doing what is the consequence of yelling out the word slab. Perhaps a better example is, when I was, I think it was the summer of 2017, I was flying with a friend to my friend Brandon. I was flying to Birmingham, England from Newark, and I believe it was on this flight. I watched the movie Arrival for the first time. And this movie struck me as a very great articulation of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, because there was one moment in that movie where, these like alien structures like kind of come down from space, and they're just kind of like hovering there. And the U.S. government, goes to recruit some people to try and figure out what's going on, how to communicate with these people. And they, in this helicopter, I believe it was a helicopter, they pick up a scientist and then a linguist. And the scientist was like, why in the world do we need a linguist? Science is the foundation of civilization, right? That's what he said. But what the movie showed was actually its language. Because the only way that the humans were able to communicate with that alien species was when the linguist, after writing out symbols, and sorry if this is a spoiler, I should say that, right? Spoiler. After writing out symbols, acting it out. It was only by writing a symbol and then doing what that symbol meant that they were able to communicate with one another. It's the same way, like, for example, let's say you go to a different country, okay, and you need to find some water, all right, or you're thirsty. How do you convey that you're thirsty? Of course, you don't just say thirst. You don't say, I'm thirsty, I need water. You kind of act out like what happens when you are thirsty. What is it like to quench your thirst, right? So you imagine like, drinking water, right? You're doing the actual activity. You are using the word in the way that it corresponds to a form of life. Something different, of course, that it may be a cat or a tiger or a lion or whatever, right, is not going to make this, because that's not how they drink water. That's not how they quench their thirst. Language in this way then evolves over time. It is plastic in a sense. As Wittgenstein says, our language is like an ancient city with new and old streets, new and old houses, where we are kind of thrown into, I know that's a Heideggerian word, but we're thrown into a context where we adopt or we take up words that previously meant different things, and yet now we have them with their legacy. We create new terms. I mean, like, for example, tweet, right? The word tweet is something new. Bless you, right? If someone sneezes, we say bless you. Whereas that might have had a very specific meaning in the past, right? To literally bless someone if it was thought they had, demons or whatever, right? Now it's just a way of kind of checking in on the health of someone, that perhaps, like the word salud, in Spanish conveys, I think, a bit more literally. So as Wittgenstein says, but how many kinds of sentence are there? There are countless kinds, countless different kinds of use of all the things we call signs, words, sentences. And this diversity is not something fixed, given once and for all. But new types of language, new language games, as we may say, come into existence, and others become obsolete and forgotten. Our language changes as our form of life changes. Now, this might leave us with a very important philosophical question. Are there transcendent truths that can be thought in the abstract, right? If language is practical in this sense, what does this mean about transcendent immaterial truths? Wittgenstein says, where our language suggests a body and there is none, there, we should like to say, is a spirit. We often think about this in the terms of investigating the beautiful, right? What is the nature of beauty? The truth, right? What is truth as something that is has an essence to it, right? That if there is an idea, for example, which is true, it contains some kind of character that is found in all things that are called true. Same thing with knowledge or God, right? What is the nature of God? Is there a God? These metaphysical questions that we investigate in the abstract. Wittgenstein says that this basically is a case that when we use this metaphysical language, a soul, right, talk of a soul or whatever else, this only has sense if it is used by people to convey ideas insofar as they are part of an activity. So we can say that whether there is a God or is not a God, right, that actually does make sense. This kind of religious or metaphysical language makes sense if by that we mean we go to a church and we pray or whatever else, right? We engage in a ritual. But it doesn't actually mean, though, that there is something which goes beyond the activity, which is immaterially there, unless that immateriality can be acted out in some activity in which it can be used. Philosophical problems arise, Wittgenstein says, when language goes on holiday, right? When the words we use are no longer used within the context that they make sense. So if I talk about, for example, the nature of a cup, okay? And I talk about some kind of ideal cupness, right? It's hard to understand what exactly this ideal cupness is. Whereas if I talk about a cup and I, for example, right, I just point to or demonstrate a cup, right, and I can point to many different kinds of cups. That makes sense because we can use it. We can actually demonstrate the meaning of the word cup. But if I start talking about the ideal cup, well, I mean, what is the difference of an ideal cup from this particular cup, right? This is the problem with metaphysics, right? In this way, Wittgenstein here is arguing for a kind of non-essentialist philosophy of language. So unlike logical positivism, which says that it is never the case that religious or metaphysical language has sense, Wittgenstein says, no, it can be the case that it has sense, right? If it is used in some activity like rituals, then it has sense. But it doesn't have sense if we mean that there is an essence, a nature to religion, that there is an essence or a nature to God. Again, unless it can be acted out. He says, and then we may indeed imagine naming to be some remarkable mental act when language goes on holiday, as it were the baptism of an object. And we can also say the word this to the object, as it were address the object as this, a strange use of this word which perhaps occurs only when philosophizing. So what Wittgenstein is doing is trying to kind of be a therapist for philosophers. Philosophers who are insistent at getting to the bottom of the truth of things. And Wittgenstein wants to say, you don't need to do that, right? You don't have to get to the nature of things. Because you start taking the ordinary language which we use out of its context. And when you do that, you can go on talking about things forever because they're no longer grounded in practice. Someone might still ask, okay, that's fine. It seems, right, like with our ordinary language usage, that the meaning of a word is its use in that language. But how is it that we can still talk about the same things, like a cup, if there is no essence that unites all of them together? If there is no essence to a thing that is signified, like by the word cup, by the word book, by the word Austin, then how can we talk about the same thing or groups of things? Wittgenstein says, consider, for example, the activities that we call games. I mean, board games, card games, ball games, athletic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say they must have something in common or they would not be called games. But look and see whether there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you won't see something that is common to all, but similarities, affinities, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. So stop philosophizing about, right, the natures of things and just look at how people behave when they use those words, when they say those words. So, for example, if we want to know, right, like what is a game? Well, there are some games we might think, well, a game requires competition with other people. Yet there are some games, I'm blanking on the name of that card game, Solitaire, right? Solitaire does not require, I mean, you can actually play against another person, although I think most people don't. Most people don't play that game against another person, right? They play by themselves. There are some games that actually require everyone, all the participants, to work together and, performing some activity, reaching some goal. Maybe you think, well, a game involves physical activity. But some other games don't involve physical activity. Maybe some games involve scoring goals. Some other games don't. What links all of these things together? Just that we use the word games for all of those activities. Games form a family. They have family resemblances. When we talk about a person, there's no essence to a person. It's just that there are family resemblances among persons. Wittgenstein says, for the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, and so on and so forth, overlap and crisscross in the same way. The strength of the thread resides not in the fact that some one fiber runs through its whole length, but in the overlapping of many fibers. That when we talk about myself, okay, Austin, right, being, part of the Kippis family, it's not that there's this one unique feature that is contained within all those people related to the Kippis family. We just look at certain resemblances, right? Oh, you have your mother's eyes, your father's nose, or whatever else, right? Resemblances, not essences. So when we talk about games, when we talk about, for example, ethical behavior, right? Whether certain actions are ethical or not, we don't do that when we say, for example, oh, that person gave to charity, right? That was a morally good thing to do. We don't mean that, or we don't know, right, in the way in which we use the word, that there is some essential feature in that activity that relates to all features that are performed in ethical behaviors. What we mean is that it resembles other activities that we consider to be ethical. So, for example, with this picture here, are these cup or bowl? I assume we would say, for example, that maybe number 1 is a cup. But maybe number 4 is a bowl. I mean, it looks like it's shaped like a cup. The only feature that's different, it seems like, from number 1 is that it's much wider. Yet, if we go to a restaurant, right, and we want to order a cup of soup or a bowl of soup, it wouldn't be uncommon to be served a bowl of soup and something that looked like the diagram of number 4, that image, that very wide-looking thing with a handle on it. What is the difference? Or I'm, reminded of Starbucks. You go to Starbucks, okay? You can get a tall, a grande, a venti. All of them actually literally mean the same thing, and yet we use the words differently. How is it that a barista knows that you want a medium-sized cup when you say grande? Because what grande means in that context, right, the language game you're playing when you walk into Starbucks is different from if you were speaking Spanish to someone else about something else. Think about a chair. Is there an essence to a chair? Perhaps we want to say, well, a chair is something that it's something that you sit in, okay? The nature of a chair, anything that is a chair is something that you can sit in. Well, couldn't we find, for example, a couch? We sit in a couch, so it doesn't seem like a couch is that one uniting feature that makes a chair a chair. So perhaps you want to say, well, a chair is something that you sit in that has 4 legs. Okay. But can we often find oddly shaped chairs, maybe ones that have 3 legs, ones that have no legs at all, that are maybe like a cylinder with a back? We might talk about those as being chairs. They don't have 4 legs. We could look at a painting, and we would say, look, that's a painting of a chair on the wall. Yet you can't sit in it, and we still refer to it as a chair. Right? In all those different cases, there is no one attribute that is the essence linking all those different things that we call chair a chair, right? There's always the possibility that there is something else that exceeds our definition given when we name things. I want to end by considering briefly some social, political, and ethical implications of this kind of a philosophy of language. For example, what is a religion? I mentioned that earlier. I mean, if we think a religion has a definite essence to it, right? That we want to talk about, one thing is a cult, another thing is a religion. We often use that word only based on historical distance from the time that religion was created. So, for example, when Mormonism would have been created, it would have been thought of by most people as being a cult. Yet, now it is widely recognized as a religion. I mean, by the United States government, for example, it's recognized as a religion where it doesn't have to pay taxes. I mean, think of Scientology, right? It's recognized by the United States government as a religion where it doesn't have to pay taxes. Our understanding of what a religion means, right, what it is, changes over time as our different uses of that word change. What is a child? I mean, the implications of this are very serious. Think about, right, when you're a child and then when you're an adult. We talk about 18 being an adult, right, when you're no longer considered legally a child. Is there someone essential feature that one is given when they turn 18 that they didn't have the second before they turned 18? Probably not. I mean, I assume we don't really think that. Yet we talk about people being a child or not, right? Based on the way in which we use that word child. I'm, thinking about that controversial movie that's out. What is a woman? What is a woman? Well, according to Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, a woman is whatever we use the word to mean, right? There is no essential feature to what a woman is. I mean, think of this with like a man, for example. This idea that a man is the breadwinner of the family, right? That's something that's really only, especially in the American context, something that's really only 70 maybe 80 years old. We know, prior to the agricultural revolution around 10,000 BCE, we had matriarchal societies where it was the woman who was in charge of the household. Women ran the collection of individuals living in kind of like a tribe. So this idea of a man being a leader in this, sense or political sense or whatever else, right? That has changed over time based on the form of life of those human beings as they have changed. In the same way, what it means to be a woman, according to this philosophy of language, changes over time, whatever the use of that term is. Is a woman something that has, childbearing capacities? Well, if that's the case, then that means what we might call a trans man could be a woman as well, because they have childbearing capacities. Or it could mean that that definition of a woman as just one that has childbearing capacities doesn't make sense, because there are many people who we would consider women that don't have childbearing capacities, like women that have already gone through menopause, or some women that aren't able to have children at all. Right? So that essential feature that we want to say defines what a woman is, for example, it doesn't work when we look at different uses of that word woman. It's malleable based on the context, the use of the term. Finally, think about the term human. What is a human? Well, depends on the use. And there are some serious implications from this. We've seen throughout history the way in which human beings can be dehumanized. We can think about ethical, like medical ethical considerations about whether someone should have political rights just because they have severe cognitive disabilities, right? Do you have to possess the capacity to reason to be treated with respect? Or would we say that, someone that has severe cognitive disabilities and therefore can't reason still should be treated with respect because they are a human being? Right? Traditionally, philosophy has said a human being is an animal that possesses reason. Yet we might say some individuals with a severe cognitive disability don't possess the ability to reason. Perhaps then we might want to rethink our definition of what a human is, because the way in which we use that term, right, we wouldn't go and just treat people with severe cognitive disabilities like garbage. At least I hope we would not, right? So the point is, while there are metaphysical implications of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language insofar as it is an anti-essentialist philosophy, there are also very important ethical and social political implications to be considered as well with this philosophy of language.